The sun poured through the tall windows of the federal courthouse, casting long, golden beams across the polished marble floor. In the hushed stillness of the hallway, people in dark suits and crisp dresses moved in quiet procession toward Courtroom. 7B, some carried leather briefcases. Others held folders thick with papers. A few whispered among themselves, heads bowed in serious conversation. At the front of the line, Bailiff Harris stood tall in his uniform, his posture straight and his eyes alert. He glanced at his watch, then tapped his clipboard, signaling that it was time. Inside the courtroom, rows of wooden benches faced the towering bench where Judge Victoria Reynolds would soon preside. The walls were lined with dark wood panels carved with intricate patterns. Above the judge's bench, the Great Seal of the United States gleamed in muted tones of gold and cobalt. Here, walls and furniture spoke of solemn history and the weight of law. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper. Reporters and spectators filled the back rows, their cameras and notepads ready. Lawyers and their clients gathered near tables in the front, arranging papers, whispering final arguments, and smoothing ties or adjusting scarves at precisely 9:00, the bailiff called out, "All rise." In an instant, every person in the room stood. The sound of rustling coats and shifting feet rippled through the space, all except one. Sterling Hale stayed seated in the front row. He sat in a sleek leather chair that had been set aside for him. His gaze was fixed on his phone, and a small, amused smile played at the corner of his lips. He wore a gray designer suit that fit him perfectly, its lines emphasizing his tall, powerful frame. His cufflinks flashed silver in the morning light. Everything about him said wealth, success, and confidence. Behind him, the courtroom murmured. Someone cleared a throat, and another person glanced nervously at the judge's bench. The room felt held in balance, as though it might tip in one direction or another at any moment. At the front, the heavy doors opened, and Judge Victoria Reynolds entered. Her black robes moved with her as she walked, and she carried herself with a quiet authority that filled the room. People stiffened in their seats, and even Sterling looked up from his phone for a moment, just enough to meet her calm, steady gaze. Victoria paused at the bench, watching the sea of faces before her. Her hair was pulled back into a neat bun. Her glasses rested lightly on the bridge of her nose. In her hands she held a stack of case files. She set them down on the bench with care, not a single page out of place. The tip of her gavel peeked from a small stand nearby. She looked out over the room until the last whisper of movement fell silent. Then she spoke, her voice clear but gentle. "Be seated," she said. As the audience took their seats, Sterling remained seated, folding his arms and tapping his foot. In a slow rhythm, he did not look away from his phone. His posture was relaxed, almost casual, as though he owned the room. A few people shifted uncomfortably. One of the lawyers at the front turned around to nudge the bailiff. The bailiff leaned toward Sterling and whispered something. Sterling nodded once without looking up, and the bailiff stepped back. Victoria began to speak. She introduced the case before her, a matter of breach of contract between Sterling Hale's company and a partner who claimed unfair treatment. The papers lay open before her as she called each party by name. Her tone was professional, respectful, and fair. Even though this case involved billions of dollars, she treated it with the same care she would any civil matter. Every so often, she paused to let her words settle, giving the lawyers time to prepare their next arguments. From the bench, Victoria could see Sterling's face in profile. His jaw was strong, his expression confident. He shifted again in his seat, finally lowering his phone to rest it on his knee. He folded his hands together, tapping his fingers lightly. His eyes met hers just once. In that instant, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Victoria felt the weight of his gaze, but she did not waver. She continued reading from her notes. Behind Victoria, the federal seal seemed to glow, as though reminding everyone that here, in this room, the rule of law was above status or wealth. Victoria paused again and looked down at her papers. Then she looked up at Sterling. "Mr. Hale," she said, "this courtroom operates under a simple rule. When the court is in session, Every person shall stand when the judge enters or leaves. Do you understand that? Sterling straightened in his chair, his lips curved in a small, amused smile. Yes, he said. His voice carried easily across the room. He paused, then added, but I choose not to. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Some gasped. Others were silent, their eyes flicking between Sterling and the judge. The bailiff walked to Sterling's side again, his face serious. He bent slightly and spoke in a low voice, perhaps reminding Sterling of the court's rules. Sterling listened, his mouth twitching, as though he found the whole exchange entertaining, but he did not stand. He folded his arms once more and leaned back. Victoria closed the file before her. The knock of the gavel filled the room with a sharp sound. Mr. Hale, she said, her voice steady, the court does not tolerate defiance. If you remain seated, I will be forced to hold you in contempt. Sterling lifted his chin. His eyes glinted with challenge. Still, he did not stand. His refusal was silent but powerful. In that moment, he seemed to embody arrogance itself. Yet, Victoria did not rush. She waited, allowing the stillness to grow tense. Reporters clicked their pens. The spectators shifted. The lawyers on both sides leaned forward, curious to see what would happen. Finally, Sterling set his jaw and spoke. Do as you must, he said. His tone was cool, detached. He crossed one leg over the other, folding himself into a posture of calm defiance. With a firm nod, Victoria raised her gavel again. So be it, she said. Court is adjourned for a brief recess while I consider a contempt citation. Rose from her seat and left the bench. The marshals opened a side. Dora and Victoria walked out of the courtroom. Her robes whispered across the floor. Behind her, the door closed softly. But its click echoed in the charged air. In the sudden emptiness, Sterling remained seated, alone in the front row. The room felt vast and silent without the judge's presence. He looked around slowly, as if seeing the benches for the first time. Few spectators stared back at him, their eyes wide. A photographer snapped a picture. The cameras flashed bright in the dimmed light. Outside the courtroom, Victoria paused, leaning against the cool wall of the hallway. She closed her eyes for a moment and took a deep breath. The marble walls seemed to hum with the echoes of loyalty to the law. She thought of her grandmother, who had taught her that respect was earned by fairness, not demanded by authority. She thought of the causes she had fought for in her community, where people had stood tall when the world tried to push them down. This moment would be one more step in that long journey. A court clerk approached with a notepad. Your Honor. I've prepared the paperwork, the clerk said quietly. Victoria nodded and took the documents. She reviewed them quickly, writing a few notes in her neat handwriting. Then she signed her name. The clerk bowed his head and slipped the papers into a folder. Victoria moved down the corridor toward her chambers. As the doors closed behind her. The hallway fell silent once more. In courtroom 7B, the marshal approached Sterling Hale. Sir, he said, if you would please follow me. Sterling stood slowly, his expression still unreadable. He slipped out his phone and tucked it into his pocket. Then he followed the marshal through the side door. Reporters rushed forward, microphones extended. In low, urgent tones, they asked if he regretted his decision. Sterling gave no answer as he passed through the door. The cameras clicked and whirred, capturing the moment. Then the door closed behind him, leaving only the empty courtroom and the soft echo of the judge's gavel in the air. In every chair, a story lingered, of power, of authority, and of the quiet strength that comes from doing what is right. For one shining moment, at least. The marble walls of 7B had reminded everyone that in this place, respect for the rule of law was more important than any title, any fortune, or any legacy. The courtroom reconvened after a short break. Victoria Reynolds returned to the bench, her robe flowing behind her like a calm tide. She carried a small stack of papers in her hand. Sterling Hale sat off to the side, just past the lawyers' tables. A uniformed marshal stood by his chair, arms folded. Sterling's face was unreadable. His eyes held the same cool confidence as before, but now there was a hint of tension in the set of his jaw. Victoria set the papers down and lifted her gaze. She looked over each row, making sure she had everyone's attention. The room fell silent. Even the reporters stopped tapping their pens. She spoke evenly. This court has found Mr. Sterling Hale in contempt for his refusal to stand when the court was in session. A citation has been entered. Sterling sat still, did not flinch. Victoria paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. Then she spoke again. Despite that contempt citation, we will now resume the hearing on the breach of contract case. I remind everyone that this court's priority is justice. Wealth and status do not alter the facts before us. A lawyer for Sterling's company rose first. He was a tall man with close-cropped hair and a calm voice. He began reviewing the contract terms, speaking with quiet force. He explained how Sterling's firm had fulfilled its obligations, citing specific clauses and dates. He unfolded charts and passed copies to the opposing counsel. His words were clear, his reasoning precise. Opposing counsel stood next.
Ow.
She was a woman with sharp eyes and a gentle voice that could shift to steel when needed. She argued that Sterling's firm had withheld key information and delayed payments. She spoke of the partner company's struggles and the real-world impact of each missed deadline. She told stories of lost jobs and empty factories, painting a picture of hardship caused by the breach. Her voice trembled once, but she did not break. The courtroom listened. Victoria watched both sides with careful interest. Every so often, she made a note. She leaned forward, listening to details about invoices and meeting minutes. It's about handshake agreements and third-party witnesses. Sometimes, she asked a question. Can you clarify the date on this amendment? Or was there a record of that phone call? Questions were simple but precise, aimed at uncovering the truth. Sterling's lawyer answered each question smoothly. Then the other side responded in kind. The back and forth built tension like a rising tide, yet Sterling himself remained calm. He did not interrupt. He folded his hands, resting them on his lap. His eyes drifted from the lawyers to the judges. Bench and back again, measuring, weighing. As the morning wore on, the story unfolded in layers. The contract had several versions. Some changes were well documented. Others existed only in email drafts. A key witness was a project manager who had since left the company and moved overseas. Both sides spoke of that person's reliability. Jurors, well, this was not a jury case, but the spectators leaned forward. Drawn into the unfolding drama, Victoria called for a short recess at lunchtime. The lawyers gathered their papers. Reporters rose with cameras. Sterling slipped quietly out of his seat and followed the marshal. Victoria descended the bench and walked to her chambers. In her private office, Victoria sat behind a polished oak desk. She poured herself a glass of water and leaned back. She thought about the morning sessions, the fine points of contract, law, the human stories behind the legal filings, and most of all, the challenge of keeping the courtroom a place of respect. Her mind turned briefly back to Sterling's contempt. That act of defiance was still fresh. She refused to let it distract her from the case's substance. After a few minutes, she returned to the bench. The courtroom fell silent again. Victoria stood and called the hearing back to order. We will now hear from Mr. Hale himself, she said. All eyes turned toward Sterling. The lawyers beside him straightened, anticipating his testimony. Sterling rose. He walked to the witness stand with slow confidence. He turned, looked at Victoria, and nodded slightly. Then he sat, folded one leg over the other, and folded his hands. His lawyer stepped forward. Mr. Hale, his lawyer began, can you tell the court about your understanding of the partnership agreement? Sterling spoke in a clear, steady voice. He described how he had personally negotiated key provisions. He explained what he believed the other party had promised and how he had acted in good faith. He recounted phone calls, meetings in boardrooms, and emails that followed. His words painted him as a hands-on leader who cared about the details. Opposing counsel rose. Mr. Hale, do you recall the email from April 12th in which you acknowledged payment delays? Sterling hesitated for the first time. His brow furrowed. He glanced at his lawyer. Then he turned back to the judge. I don't recall that specifically, he said. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Victoria lifted an eyebrow. Let me show you the email, she said. The clerk handed her a printout. Victoria held it up, its text clear to all. She read, "We regret the delay in payment. We're working to resolve the issue by month's end." Sterling's face tightened. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He nodded slowly. "Yes," he said, "that is our email. But that was a delay we intended to fix immediately." Opposing counsel pressed further. "Sir, when did you inform your partner that the funds were ready?" Sterling looked down at his hands. He took a breath. "After I returned from a business trip," he said, "within 2 days." The lawyer turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I would like to submit bank statements showing the transfer took place 5 weeks later." She passed the documents forward. Victoria received them and placed them in a folder. "Thank you," she said. Sterling rose from the stand. He walked back to his seat, his shoulders squared. The testimony had revealed a gap between his belief and the record. He sat, expression steady, but eyes thoughtful. The courtroom air felt charged. Victoria turned to the lawyers on both sides. "I will take these matters under submission. Please submit any final briefs by the end of the week." She tapped her gavel once. "Court is adjourned." As people stood, Sterling remained seated again. This time, there was no reminder. The bailiff watched him, silent. Victoria rose from the bench and looked directly at Sterling. His gaze met hers. No shame, no apology, only cool resolve. Then Victoria turned and left the courtroom. Reporters swarmed Sterling as he exited. "Mr. Hale, are you sorry for not standing earlier? Do you have any regrets about your testimony?" Cameras flashed. Sterling paused at the door, raised his chin, and replied in a calm voice, "I acted on principle. The real question is, when will this court act on principle?" Outside, the sun was high in the sky. The courthouse steps were crowded. Victoria walked down another hall to meet with her clerk. Sterling stepped onto the plaza, flanked by his security detail. He moved with purpose, as though untouched by the court's authority. Inside her chambers, Victoria sat at her desk and opened her law files. She thought about the evidence, the testimony, and the contract terms. She thought about the contempt, citation, and the power of symbols standing for respect, sitting for defiance. She realized that both sides believed they were right. Both fought passionately for their views. That evening, when the courthouse was quiet, Victoria drafted her ruling. She weighed every word carefully, mindful that her opinion would reach far beyond these walls. She wrote about the facts and the law. She wrote about respect for the court and respect for the people who came seeking justice. Her final paragraph touched on something deeper, the idea that a courtroom is not just a place of rules and procedures, but a space where all people, regardless of status, can find a measure of fairness. She closed her eyes and signed her name. By the time Victoria left the building, the sky had turned pink at the horizon. Sterling was already out of sight, his car pulling away from the curb. The courthouse lights glowed softly behind her as she stepped into the evening air. She paused, looked back at the building, and felt a quiet pride. She knew that tomorrow, when she read news headlines, she would see stories about contempt and contract law. But she hoped the real story would be about justice, about a judge who refused to let an act of arrogance define a courtroom, and whose quiet strength reminded everyone that fairness belongs to all. The morning light filtered through the high windows as people filed into courtroom 7B once more. The air felt charged with expectation. Reporters clicked their pens, lawyers arranged their papers, and spectators whispered quietly among themselves. Judge Victoria Reynolds took her seat behind the bench, her robe smooth and neat. She looked at the assembled group with calm authority. At her side sat the court clerk, ready to hand up the ruling. Sterling Hale sat in the front row, flanked by his lawyer and the marshal who still kept watch. His posture was composed, but there was a flicker of tension in his eyes. He had read the headlines by now, stories of contempt, stories of an important contract dispute, stories about respect for the law. Yet he faced the moment with his usual quiet confidence. He met Victoria's gaze for a brief instant, then looked down at his folded hands. Victoria lifted a thick sheaf of paper from the clerk's desk. The rustle of pages echoed softly in the hushed room. She cleared her throat and began to speak in a steady voice. This court has reviewed the evidence, the testimony, and the arguments from both sides. It is my duty to apply the law impartially, without regard to wealth, rank, or influence. She paused, letting the words sink in. All eyes stayed fixed on her. She spoke of the contract's terms and the events that followed. She described how Sterling's company had agreed to specific payment dates and how the partner company had relied on those dates to plan operations. She noted that Sterling himself had acknowledged delays in writing and had later failed to correct them in a timely way. She referenced the bank statements and emails that showed a gap of weeks between promise and payment. Then she addressed the contempt citation. In a calm tone, she said, "This court also finds that the act of defiance at the opening of these proceedings undermined the dignity and authority of this bench. Yet the law values fairness above punishment. Therefore, while the citation stands on the record, this court will not impose additional fines or jail time for contempt." A murmur rose in the gallery, but she waited until it died down before continuing. Victoria's voice grew firmer as she delivered her final judgment on the breach of contract. On the question of liability, the court finds in favor of the plaintiff. Partner company, Sterling Hale's firm, is ordered to pay the sum of $25 million, plus interest, to make whole the damages caused by the delay. She looked down at her papers and then up at the courtroom. This judgment is to be paid within 30 days. Our gavel tapped once, crisp and clear. Court is adjourned. For a moment, the room was silent. Sterling remained seated, his face unreadable, and reporters rushed forward, shouting questions. Lawyers whispered urgent notes to clients. Some spectators stood and stretched after the long wait. Sterling rose slowly, closing his briefcase with a soft click. He met his lawyer's eyes, then looked across the room at Victoria, still seated behind the bench. Suddenly, Sterling moved. In an unexpected way, he reached out his hand to the marshal and asked quietly, "May I approach the bench?" The marshal nodded. Victoria looked surprised but inclined her head. Sterling walked up the steps and halted at the bottom of the bench. He looked up at the judge with a seriousness that sounded in his voice when he spoke. "Your Honor," he said, "I wish to address the court." Victoria watched him carefully. She nodded again, and Sterling continued. "I want to acknowledge my actions from the first day of this trial. I was wrong not to stand when you entered. I see now that my defiance was disrespectful, not only to you, but to the court and to the principle of impartial justice." His voice was clear, his tone sincere. The courtroom held its breath. Neither lawyers nor reporters interrupted. Sterling looked at Victoria. "I apologize for that act. It was an error in judgment on my part. I ask that you accept my apology and know that I respect this court and its work." He paused, then straightened up and took a step back, folding his hands once more. Victoria regarded him for a moment. Then she stood and tapped her gavel lightly. "The apology is accepted," she said. Her voice carried both authority and grace. She added, "Let this serve as a reminder that respect and courtesy form the foundation of our legal system." A murmur of approval rippled through the room. Sterling bowed his head once, then turned and walked back to his seat. Reporters shouted questions again, but Sterling's lawyer guided him steadily toward the exit. Outside the courtroom door, cameras flashed as he passed through, still flanked by his security detail. Inside, Victoria sat at her bench and exhaled gently. She gathered her papers and stood. In the hallway outside her chambers, clerks and bailiffs paused to nod respectfully. She returned their nods and continued down the corridor. Later that afternoon, Sterling's company issued a public statement. He was quoted as saying he respected the court's decision and that he would ensure prompt payment of the judgment. The statement made headlines not only because of the large sum, but also because of his apology. Many commented on how rare it was for a billionaire to admit fault in public. In her chambers, Victoria read the headlines on her phone. She allowed herself a small smile. She thought of the day's events, of the law's power to correct wrongs, of the dignity of the courtroom, and of the surprising grace in Sterling's final gesture. She reflected on how an act of apology could carry as much weight as the gavel's authority. That evening, as the sun dipped below the city skyline, Victoria walked home along quiet streets. The courthouse stood behind her, its windows dark now. She passed under streetlights, thinking about the work still to come. For every case that ended, another would begin. But today had been a good day for justice. On dinner tables across the city, people talked about the trial's end. Some praised Victoria Reynolds for her fair handling of the case. Others discussed Sterling Hale's apology and what it meant for public life. Newspapers published analyses of the legal issues. Television news shows replayed moments from the trial. In the days that followed, the judgment remained in the news. Opinion pieces debated the larger lessons that no one is above the law, that respect is earned through action, and that even the powerful can learn humility. Victoria continued her work on other cases, but she found herself thinking often of the moment when Sterling stood before her and said, "I was wrong." Months later, an article appeared profiling both Victoria Reynolds and Sterling Hale. It spoke of their meeting in the courtroom that day, a clash of power and principle, and of how the moment ended, not in resentment, but in mutual respect. It noted how the court's decision had a ripple effect, inspiring discussion about ethics in business and leadership. Victoria kept a copy of that article in her chambers. She read it when she needed a reminder of why she became a judge. Thought of her grandmother's words, "Stand for what is right, and you will find strength in your own heart." Victoria believed those words still mattered, and Sterling Hale, in his boardroom, kept a copy of the court's opinion on his desk. He had placed it beside the company's charter as a symbol that rules applied equally to everyone. When new contracts were drawn, he insisted on clear terms and timely payments. His firm's culture shifted in small ways: more transparency, more follow-through because of what happened in that courtroom. In the end, the episode became more than a news story. It became a lesson that fairness rests on respect, that law matters only when it is honored, and that apologies can rebuild trust. In Courtroom 7B, Judge Victoria Reynolds had shown how quiet resolve and fair judgment could guide a moment of conflict toward understanding and growth, and in that shared moment, both judge and defendant had found a deeper respect for the process that binds us all. The next morning, the courthouse steps were alive with activity before the sun had even climbed high in the sky. Porters jostled for position, their cameras and microphones pointed toward the grand stone doors. Lawyers hurried in, briefcases in hand, and tourists paused to watch. Some whispered about yesterday's events, about the billionaire who dared to stay seated, and the judge who let him apologize. A school group on a field trip huddled together, wide-eyed, as their teacher explained the meaning of contempt and justice. Inside Courtroom 7B, the air felt different. The polished wood no longer gleamed with the tension of trial. Instead, it held a quiet dignity, as if it still remembered the firm knock of Victoria Reynolds's gavel. Clerk tables were reset, fresh benches wiped clean. A new case file sat on the judge's desk, waiting. But for a few moments before court opened, Victoria stood alone behind the bench, looking out at the empty room. She touched the edge of her gavel gently, as though recalling the powerful moment when Sterling Hale had spoken his apology and the court had accepted it. When court opened, the bailiff called, "All rise," and every person stood, including those who crowded the gallery for the next hearing. Sterling Hale was not present. Instead, today's case involved a small business owner suing a contractor. Victoria greeted the lawyers and moved through the morning's proceedings with the same calm focus that had guided her through the previous day. Yet behind each question she asked, behind every note she took, lay the memory of how respect and fairness had triumphed over arrogance. Meanwhile, Sterling's world had shifted. He arrived at his sleek office tower on the edge of the city's financial district. Lobby's marble floors gleamed under crystal chandeliers. His security cleared the way as he passed through multiple glass doors into a boardroom that overlooked the skyline.
Round the table
Sat his executive team chief financial officer, head of legal public relations director.
all of them knew.
Why Sterling had called the meeting so early. "Good morning," Sterling said, his voice steady. But he looked at the PR director, Maria Chen, and asked, "How are we handling the fallout from yesterday?" Maria opened her laptop and brought up news clips. On one screen, a talk show host praised the judge's fair ruling. On another, a financial news site analyzed how the judgment could affect the company's stock price. On social media, commentators debated the billionaire's decision to apologize. Maria clicked through graphs showing public sentiment steadily improving after Sterling's apology. Sterling leaned back. "I expected some backlash," he said, "but I did not expect the apology to be the big story." He frowned slightly, as if puzzling over how an act meant to show respect had become the highlight. Maria nodded. "Your apology humanized you," she said. "People see you as someone who owns up to mistakes. That's rare in your position." Sterling considered her words. He realized that humility could be a strength. He resolved to carry forward the lesson. Even wealth meant little if respect for others was lacking. Back in the courthouse, Victoria took a brief lunch break with her mentor, retired Judge Eleanor Grant. They sat in the small judge's lounge, drinking coffee and eating sandwiches. Eleanor smiled as Victoria recounted yesterday's scene, how Sterling had spoken those words of regret, how the courtroom had held its breath. "You handled that with grace," Eleanor said. "You gave him room to do the right thing," Victoria shook her head. "I only did what felt fair," she said. I believed he deserved that chance." Eleanor leaned forward. "That belief is what makes you a great judge." After lunch, Victoria returned to her chambers to finalize an opinion in another case. Her clerk, a young lawyer named Marcus, brought her drafts and legal research. As they worked, Marcus asked, "Did you see the article about the community outreach event? They're calling it Justice Day, with seminars on the law and respect." Victoria smiled. She had not planned such an event, but other groups had picked up the theme. She thought of how yesterday's trial had inspired conversations beyond courtroom walls, conversations about fairness, humility, and respect in daily life. That evening, Sterling attended a charity gala for educational scholarships. He stood under sparkling lights, greeting guests and shaking hands. A reporter approached him and asked how it felt to stand on stage after being seated in court. Sterling paused, then answered honestly, "It felt right to stand when respect is due." That lesson applies everywhere in court, at work, and in life. The reporter nodded, as if impressed by the sincerity in his voice. Around him, donors whispered that Sterling's words had given new meaning to the evening's purpose. Across town, Victoria spoke at a community center event organized by a local bar association. Men and women in suits, jeans, and dresses filled. Folding chairs, she spoke about the rule of law, the importance of courtesy, and how a courtroom thrives when every person shows respect. She told them the story of Sterling Hale's defiance and apology, not to shame him, but to show how even moments of conflict can lead to understanding and growth. The audience leaned forward, nodding, taking notes. When she finished, a young man raised his hand, said he was starting his own business, and asked how to ensure he treated partners fairly. Victoria smiled and shared advice. "Be clear in your agreements, honor your commitments, and never forget that respect is the foundation of every successful relationship." The man thanked her, and others lined up to ask questions about legal aid clinics and mentoring programs. Victoria realized that the power of yesterday's moment had stretched into many lives, sparking real change. That night, Victoria and Sterling each reflected on the day in quieter settings. Victoria sat at her kitchen table, writing in her journal. She wrote of the small business case, the seminar, and her mentor's praise. She thought about how justice was more than rules. It was a living practice in real communities. Sterling sat in his office, surrounded by trophies and framed degrees. He looked at the court opinion hanging in a silver frame on his wall. He thought of the judge's calm fairness, of how she had given him the chance to apologize. He promised himself to carry that lesson into every board meeting, every handshake, every interaction. In the days that followed, the phrase "Stand for Respect" appeared on t-shirts and coffee mugs. A local school used it as a motto for a civics project. An online campaign encouraged people to share stories of simple acts of courtesy. The ripple spread far beyond Courtroom 7B, and though new trials began and new challenges emerged, the courthouse walls seemed to glow with the memory of one clear day when a judge and a billionaire found common ground in respect and justice. Each morning, as Victoria strode into the courtroom and Sterling walked through his lobby doors, they carried that moment with them, a reminder that true power lies not in wealth or status alone, but in the willingness to stand, to listen, and to do what is fair. The weeks that followed felt different in both Sterling Hale's world and in Judge Victoria Reynolds' life. News outlets continued to speak of the courtroom drama, but the story evolved from a scandal about defiance into one about respect and growth. Sterling's company paid the judgment on time, and small headlines noted how he had ensured the partner firm could reopen shuttered factories and bring back laid-off workers. That outcome became a common talking point. Money could mend mistakes, but humility healed divides. In his office, Sterling looked at the framed court opinion each morning. Its words clear, fair, and firm reminded him why he had chosen to apologize. He began meetings by asking about his team's well-being, listening more carefully than before. He instructed managers to honor deadlines and communicate honestly, even when delays were unavoidable. Employees noticed the change, spoke in hushed appreciation of a leader who now admitted when he was wrong and worked to fix it. On the 23rd of that month, Sterling invited the partner company's CEO, Miss Alvarez, to his boardroom. He served coffee and pastries on fine china, and they spoke candidly about the past months. Alvarez thanked him for making good on the payment and for reshaping his company's culture. She said employees felt valued again. Sterling nodded, grateful for her trust. He offered to work on future projects together, promising transparency in every step. Alvarez agreed, and they shook hands this time with genuine warmth. Meanwhile, Judge Reynolds prepared for her next cases, but carried with her the lessons of the trial. She arranged for the courthouse to host workshops for lawyers and students on courtroom etiquette and the importance of civility. Attendance exceeded expectations. People from all walks of life came to learn why standing when the judge enters was more than a formality. It was a sign that the law binds everyone equally. Victoria also visited local schools, telling students stories of real justice in action. She spoke of Sterling Hale's moment of refusal and of his apology. She encouraged young people to stand for what is right in their own lives, whether at home, in school, or on the playground. Teachers reported that students were more respectful, holding doors and listening more attentively, as though each small act of courtesy carried the weight of a promise. On the first anniversary of the trial, Ms. Chen, Sterling's public relations director, organized a joint charity event at the courthouse. Sterling and Judge Reynolds appeared together at a podium set up on the steps. Porters, community leaders, and ordinary citizens gathered to celebrate Justice and Respect Day. Sterling spoke first. He thanked Victoria for giving him the chance to apologize and for treating him fairly. He talked about his company's new commitment to honor every contract and every partner. Then Victoria spoke. She thanked Sterling for showing that even those with great power could learn humility. She emphasized that respect was not demanded by position but earned by action. She ended by inviting everyone present to stand all together. As a symbol of unity before the law, hands rose in a quiet, steady wave. Cameras clicked once more, but this time to capture a moment of shared dignity. In the months ahead, Sterling's company launched a scholarship program for students studying law and business ethics. Winners received internships at his firm and mentorship from both business leaders and legal experts. Many of those students went on to praise the program as life-changing, citing the story of the courtroom trial as proof that ethical leadership mattered. Judge Reynolds continued her work handling cases of every kind from landlord-tenant disputes to civil rights claims. In each hearing, she greeted parties with respect and insisted on clear, honest exchanges. Lawyers noted her firm but fair questions, and clients spoke afterward of feeling heard and understood. Even in routine cases, the atmosphere in Courtroom 7B conveyed the same lesson. Fairness thrives where respect flourishes. One quiet afternoon, Sterling invited Victoria to dine at a community center where his company sponsored meals for seniors. They sat at a long table with church volunteers, sharing homemade soup and bread. Sterling introduced Victoria as the person who taught him that respect could change lives. Victoria smiled and said it was the people, employees, volunteers, families, who live those lessons every day. They listened as seniors spoke of their own experiences, sharing stories of younger generations needing guidance on respect and decency. After the meal, Victoria and Sterling walked together to the community garden behind the center. Rows of vegetables and flowers grew under bright summer skies. They planted a tree, a symbol of enduring growth rooted in mutual respect. Sterling handed Victoria a watering can, and she poured water at the tree's base. Then Sterling added the last handful of soil. They stood side by side, looking down at the young sapling. Neither spoke at first. Their shared silence said more than words could. Years later, that tree stood tall and strong. Its branches provided shade to children playing nearby and to visitors tending the garden. A small plaque at its base read, "Rooted in Respect, 2025. People paused there often, reading its message. Many said they felt inspired to honor agreements, speak kindly, and live with humility, qualities that grew from small seeds of courtesy, planted by a judge and a billionaire in a courtroom long ago. Victoria retired after a distinguished career on the bench. In her farewell ceremony, lawyers and clients praised her wisdom and fairness. When she spoke, she told the story of Sterling. Hale's trial, not to boast, but to remind everyone that moments of conflict could become turning points for good. She urged the next generation of jurists to lead with both firmness and compassion. Sterling, too, eventually stepped down as CEO. He looked back on his tenure and saw how one choice to apologize had guided many changes. His company's success, no longer measured only in profits, but in community trust, ethical partnerships, and positive impact. He wrote a memoir about business and integrity, dedicating a chapter to the trial and to Judge Reynolds' example of leadership through respect. The book became a favorite among business students and legal scholars alike. In quiet moments, both Victoria and Sterling thought back to that first day in Courtroom 7B, when hands remained at rest, and when a judge offered the chance for apology rather than only punishment. They understood then and knew for the rest of their lives that respect flows in both directions, from authority to those it governs, and from those governed back to the authority when fairness is shown. And so the tale lived on, not as a mere news story, but as a real-life lesson passed down in stories, workshops, and children's books. It reminded everyone that true justice is measured not only by the law's letter, but by its spirit hand. That spirit lives in every choice to stand, to listen, and to honor one another.